Right, hello, I'm Mike Rogers. I'm going to be talking to you today about seeding in Rails. It's kind of one of those things we all pick up projects where sometimes they have none and it's just a bit rubbish. So I'm going to give you some techniques to hopefully write better seeds and then we will have better projects. So let's jump into that. What are we going to cover? Again, I'm just going to kind of explain what seeds are for those who don't know what they are. We're going to have a quick, I'm going to ask you a few questions. I'm going to tell you some fun stories and then give you some nice approaches to apply this to your project. And they're quite cool. So I'm excited to share them. Okay, so what are seeds? Chuck some emojis in your chat or raise your hand or anything if you've used seeds in your projects and you kind of know what they are. Okay, so a good few of us. Okay, so they're in like every kind of project. They're Adel. Cool. Okay, cool. So yeah, we have Rails. It has this wonderful command called Rails DB seed, and I didn't really know about seeds until I came to Rails and ran that, and then it ran a file, and nothing really happened. Now, I always go to bin setup, and that just kind of sets up your entire app, and that's great. That's very cool. In Rails, we normally keep them in like db/seeds. There's just a little file there. Normally, when I pick up projects, they have like this in it, and it is like most projects that no one really touches this file. There'd normally be this kind of contents, and I really hate this demo example because it doesn't even use like the nice find and create thing, and I'm just like, ugh, I hate that so much. If you're a bit more lucky, you maybe will get something like this where someone will have created a user and given it a password and some other good stuff, and it will only run in development. So that's nice. I don't, if something's there, that's all right. If you're really unlucky, this is something I nabbed from a project I worked on a little while ago where you just were never meant to run the seeds apparently, like ever. And I checked in the database in like production, and this value was not the same. And I was so scared seeing this. I was like, someone could accidentally just destroy our production database apparently and its tax records. Wonderful. Um, so I'm going to quickly check the vibe of the room again because I like doing that. Who here has worked on a project where there was never any seeds made? There was like nothing. Yep, we've all had that experience, and it's a terrible experience. Yeah, I hate that. I hate delivering projects or knowing that I'm going to pass on a project to someone where they're going to be picking it up and there's blank slates everywhere and they have to kind of figure out what kind of data might go in there when they're kind of clicking around like locally trying to figure it out for the first time. Who has worked on a project where they were sent a SQL dump of a file to work on? Doesn't necessarily have to be a production dump. It can be something else. Yeah, we've all had that as well. It's it's not like the worst thing in the world, but I have a story about why you should maybe try and avoid that. Um, has anyone ever worked on a project where there was really amazing seeds, which they were like, "Yeah, this is the best. Everything's perfect. I'm really happy." Ah, Honey Narando, that's you lucky person. You lucky person. I can see you nodding. And Lewis. Cool. Okay, so I'm going to tell some horror stories. So, a few years ago, I had a friend. He was sent his production database via Slack or whatever the tool was at the time. Was restored it on his local machine, was playing around, and then left his computer at work. Came in on Monday, and they came back to the door had just been lifted off its hinges, and all the computers had been stolen. And well, like a computer being stolen, it's just you just have to fill out some insurance, do some police records. It's not like the worst thing. Because they had a copy of the code in the database on there, and it was the production database, they technically had a data breach, and they had to tell the customer what had just happened. And it was really embarrassing. They were really like just red faced about the whole thing and very, very upset. And for this exact situation, it kind of made me think that, okay, so losing the code isn't the worst thing in the world, but had they used seeds locally on their local machines or development environments, well, then they wouldn't have had to tell all those customers that they've lost all their data to someone who physically came into their office. On an aside, I've heard that companies like Facebook, they make their staff SSH into machines to like never have any data touching their machine, like not even the code. And I thought that was quite a cool idea. And then I saw GitHub code spaces, you can kind of do the same. So I'm kind of wondering if maybe in the future we're going to get some lovely dev environment pop up where everyone kind of just gets to SSH into a little cloud somewhere, do their work, and then they're done for the day. Next one. I worked on a project in an agency many years ago, and we had a staging environment, and it had a copy of production straight on it. And at some point, someone turned off the emails going to like a nice, safe mail trap service, and they started going to real people. And it was really embarrassing. We had like the most stressful day because all the username and passwords were also the same. So we had all these users suddenly on our staging environment doing stuff, and we were like, "Oh gosh!" And it was really stupid thing to have happened. Like they should have never been able to really know that environment existed. And again, if we had had maybe some seed data on those preview environments to play around with, the whole situation where the client was kind of saying, "Hey, I want to look at the staging environment and I want it to be identical to production because I don't know what's here," could have been avoided. And the last one, I kind of hinted at earlier. Like we've all kind of picked up projects where you just don't know what's going on and it's stressful and there's a lot going on. And when you maybe open up a project and it's this blank slate, it's not fun. No one likes that. So we can kind of improve like the first impressions of our code base by kind of having some nice seeds and just a lovely code base and all those other niceties. And also, like if you kind of set up your local development environment with lots of stuff, so things like n+1 queries become very noticeable very quickly. You maybe might end up with way better code at the end of it. So who knows? So now that I've hopefully told you enough horror stories about why you should probably be using seeds, let's go through some kind of techniques. And you can normally use just a mix of these. There's no there's no right or wrong way. It's just using seeds and avoiding production data in your local machines is just all we need to aim for. So, and just a heads up, I'm going to be posting a link to these slides in the chat afterwards. So if you want to copy any of this code, it's totally fine. You can copy and paste it later. So this is like kind of a nice approach I've seen like around where people just will break up their seeds into multiple files, and that's wonderful. I really like that. It's like the first step of like doing good seeds where like the seeds file isn't overwhelmingly massive. There's lots of smaller files and you can kind of guess by the name what they do. And normally you can go into that and there'll be a couple of lines. You're like, oh, cool, this does this. This is great. I like this. If you're really kind of lucky though, they might use Faker. So there's this concept called like fuzz testing, where you kind of just chuck in random data to your app to see what will break. And I kind of like using it in my development environment where I just have random data, like stuff users might put in. So that piece of data I thought was this long, well, it can now be this long because my validation lets me do it. And just seeing what that looks like with all my components and kind of making me stop and think about what looks good and what's not. So very cool. And yeah, this is kind of how you'd use Faker in your tests a little bit, where you just kind of dump a little bit of fake data in just to kind of make a bit of a random environment each time. And you don't get like the same stuff you're looking at, you get like a bit of variety. And yeah, I also like to use an env like down here to kind of control when these run. This is so like if I use like a Heroku review app, then I can just be like, oh, hey, in this app, I want it to seed all this extra data, but maybe in my production one, I only want some of the data, which is kind of a nice little trick if you ever want to do that. I also found out recently that Rails actually has a thing where you can load your database fixtures into your production database, which I thought was kind of cool. So I played around with it and I ended up having loads of trouble. It kept on complaining about foreign key issues and stuff. And I was like, oh, not so sure about this. But I thought it was kind of a nice idea. And then I was like, actually, I have FactoryBot all set up, which is my preferred choice for setting up that kind of data. I wonder if I could maybe use that in my seeds because, I've got a user with channel here, but that's kind of what I want to log in as most of the time just to play around in development. And if I use the data I'm using in my seeds in my development environment and it needs to be maybe a bit more filled out, so all those columns I might normally ignore suddenly have values, I might spot things or I might spot things which are broken because like maybe in the test it will be a bit different or pick up on something, or in development I can just go build a test and then go look at what it might look like in a form or something. So I thought that was quite a cool idea. And I found that you can totally do it. It's totally doable. You just go into your seeds file, you require FactoryBot, and you do have to do like a little SQL statement to make sure you don't add stuff twice. But you can go ahead and use factorybot.create and go do your thing, and it will go create all the associations and stuff with it. So I got pretty excited by this, and I've been playing around with this a lot lately. And what I got most excited about with this is I can just run Rails DB reset like every time I change branch. I can just have a new environment sprung up, and I don't get those annoying like weird migrations where like I'm running a migration in another branch and I go to this branch and then I need to do something and then there's a random column there. It just kind of disappears because I'm constantly trashing my database with new data. And it was really cool. A quick note on this one: Thoughtbot doesn't recommend you do this. I think it's more of a they just don't want to tell you to do this because it might cause some bad times. But I think if you're using it sensibly in small bits of data, you can generally have quite a safe experience. And plus, if you're using this in local development, you can just run Rails DB reset constantly and have a wonderful time. Cool. So earlier I kind of mentioned how sometimes people get data from production and put it on their local machines. I think in development that's kind of a scary thing. Like the more stories I hear about data in production coming down to developer machines, I'm like, oh no, like so many things could go wrong. Like you could have a developer who wants to find out details about the person in production and maybe do some nasty things or what have you. So I went looking for a better solution and I found Evil Seed by Evil Martians. And what that lets you do is kind of run a little bit of code and it will create an SQL dump. But what's nice is you can say, like, okay, limit it to a few users. So instead of getting like a 10 gigabyte dump, you maybe might get 100 kilobytes. And then you could also say, okay, these fields, I want them anonymized. So that could be like sensitive data like names and email addresses and or physical addresses. And this is just generally a sensible thing you should probably be like considering doing. And yeah, I love this. This got me really excited, especially like I was just kind of thinking in my head, wouldn't it be cool if whenever you had an exception, it kind of just done a dump of that user so you could recreate that user at that point in time or something? I never built that, but I was just like, oh, imagine how fun that would be. You could just always recreate the environment perfectly. Finally, has anyone ever seen like a something like this where you have a model in your database and it has a plan and there's maybe four plans in the database and they have to be there in like staging and test and yeah, and I hate these kind of tables so much because they get everywhere and if they're not changing between your environments it's like why are they in the database? This is insane. So I've kind of been playing around with ideas of how we can get these things out of the database because if they're like a small enough bit of data, you could probably say, okay, that kind of belongs in version code control then. So what if we made a Ruby object where it just kind of returned, like when we called .all, just a list of itself or an array even with some attributes set to do the thing? Would that work? And I kind of found it worked quite nicely. Like it got the data out of the database. So when I was running like tests and stuff, it was always there and always the same. And I didn't have to constantly call like, oh, create plan before each test or whatever. But so there was less setup required. And then when I actually like used it, this is kind of how I pulled it out again. Which, yeah, I really like that. Like we've got the little memorizing there, where it's like, oh, okay, I've called the plan. This is the plan, and I've pulled it from that Ruby object over there. I found that to be nice. So consider that if you're trying to get stuff out of your database. Finally, so I also really like testing, and one of the things I think is most fun you can do with seeds is you can test them. You can have a great time. So this is kind of the approach I normally take, where it's to say, okay, I'm going to call this method called application.loadSeed, and that's just going to load that seeds file. I'm going to change the environmental variables in my test to do the thing, and then I'm just going to write a test to make sure like the right amount of objects are made in the database, which I think is a small enough test that it's not horrible to maintain. It shouldn't run without an error, and if it does run with an error, hopefully those objects won't be made in the database, which is cool, and it does all the callbacks. And the nice thing I really like about this is this way you kind of know that even if you're not constantly resetting your database or using all those other things, your seeds will still work as part of your like test suite, which I think is cool. I really like it. Also, if you're using FactoryBot, this is like I love FactoryBot so much. They've got the FactoryBot.lint thing, and what that does is it goes through all your factories and there's checks they can save and they're valid. So this is like a nice thing for this saying, okay, are all the factories I'm working with, will they actually work? I worked on a project years ago when none of them were valid, and it was like, oh, I hate this so much. I was trying to do stuff and I had to fiddle with data to get it to save properly each time, and this just made it so much easier once I started using it. Okay, so what is the best way? What is a kind of a nice summary of this talk? So some seeds are better than no seeds. Like I'm not going to say like you should use FactoryBot if you don't like that because it's not for everyone. You might have a very complicated app which is quite specific. Yeah, if you use that, that's great, and you should probably use EMVs to say like which kind of things you want. I found that to be really effective. Use them in testing, use them in development, and in preview environments. If your seeds are good enough, you can just have lots of random data in those preview environments like staging or Heroku preview apps, and then that's quite nice. You can have a good look at them always working, and that's wonderful. And then also, yeah, plain old Ruby objects. FactoryBot also really good, but most importantly, let's make sure we don't use production dumps where possible, because getting a big 10 gig file down on my local machine and then being told to restore it is not a fun use of my time. Cool, homework, because I like setting homework. I want you to have a go at making your seeds 10% better. Just maybe have a think about some of these approaches. If they make your projects better or worse, just let me know. My handle is at MikeRogers0 on Twitter. And that is me done, and hopefully my internet is nice and stable now.